For 9 years, everyone walked past the quiet woman in the corner as if she were part of the office furniture. Then one unexpected phone call from the company's insurer shattered that illusion, and by the following morning, HR was waiting outside her desk with a contract no one saw coming. Every office has a corner that somehow disappears in plain sight. Not because it's hidden behind walls or tucked away from the rest of the building, but because people gradually stop seeing what's always there. In one of those corners, beneath a window overlooking nothing more than the gray brick wall of the neighboring office complex, sat Claire Bennett. For 9 years, she arrived before most of her coworkers, placed the same slightly chipped coffee mug beside her keyboard, greeted anyone who happened to pass with a warm but quiet "good morning," and opened another stack of insurance files waiting for review. Conversations about promotions, bonuses, client dinners, and management meetings flowed around her every day like a river flowing around an old stone. She wasn't ignored because people disliked her. She was ignored because she was dependable, predictable, and always there. Over time, reliability had turned her into part of the office furniture. Most employees believed Claire's job consisted of little more than routine paperwork, yet they couldn't have been more mistaken. Every file she touched represented a potential financial risk that never became a crisis because she caught the problem before anyone else noticed it. Missing signatures, incorrect policy numbers, incomplete medical reports, inconsistent repair estimates, forgotten authorization forms, small details that looked harmless until an insurance company rejected a claim or questioned compliance during an audit. Claire quietly corrected them all. She rebuilt damaged documentation, verified every supporting record, and created a paper trail solid enough to survive the strictest compliance review. Ironically, the better she performed, the less visible her work became. When everything goes right, nobody asks who prevented disaster. They simply assume disaster was never possible in the first place. Her annual performance reviews reflected that strange reality. Managers described her as dependable, consistent, and a reliable contributor. The words sounded complimentary, yet they never translated into meaningful raises or career opportunities. Meanwhile, employees with louder personalities and shorter resumes celebrated promotions, accepted public praise during staff meetings, and proudly shared salary increases over coffee. Claire congratulated each of them with genuine kindness before quietly returning to her desk. She wasn't jealous by nature, but there were moments when the silence became unexpectedly heavy. Watching presentations built upon reports she had quietly corrected without receiving a single mention forced her to swallow disappointment more often than she admitted, even to herself. Her reputation for always getting things right created another invisible burden. Whenever an urgent project appeared, managers instinctively placed it on Claire's desk without asking whether her schedule allowed it. Coworkers joked that if anyone could untangle impossible documentation, it was her. They meant it as a compliment, yet every compliment arrived disguised as more work. One Thursday afternoon, Regional Operations Manager Daniel Brooks hurried into the department carrying an unusually thick insurance file, dropped it beside her keyboard without explanation, and simply said, "We need this finished today." There was no greeting, no appreciation, no acknowledgement that the deadline was unrealistic. Across the room, two colleagues exchanged knowing glances before one quietly whispered, "Of course it went to Claire." The other simply smiled and answered, "She always figures it out." Neither of them realized how accurately those few words described the company's entire relationship with its quietest employee. Long after most of the office lights had switched off, Claire remained at her desk comparing claim documents against insurer compliance standards. One missing attachment could delay reimbursement for weeks, while one undocumented approval could expose the company to enormous financial liability during an audit. As she worked through the stack, something caught her attention. Several unrelated claims referenced the same outside vendor. And although every document appeared perfectly organized, the consistency itself felt unnatural. Dates aligned too neatly, signatures followed identical formatting, and supporting paperwork looked almost as though it had been assembled from the same invisible template. Nothing suggested fraud, and technically every requirement had been satisfied. Yet 9 years of experience had taught Claire that paperwork could look flawless while still creating unnecessary compliance risk. Instead of accepting the files as they were, she spent another hour tracing every document back to its original source, rebuilding the documentation package piece by piece until every record could withstand the closest external scrutiny. Nobody had asked her to invest the extra time, and she never expected anyone to notice. The following Monday began like every other morning until an unfamiliar call arrived from the company's external insurance provider. Within minutes, department managers started moving through the office with unusual urgency. Conference room doors quietly closed, and conversations dropped into careful whispers. Most employees assumed it was another routine insurance compliance review. Claire listened to the change in atmosphere without saying a word, but something about the tone felt different. Truly routine reviews rarely created this kind of tension. Somewhere inside her, years of quiet experience whispered that the ordinary rhythm of the office was about to change. And before the morning ended, someone outside the company would ask a question that nobody inside had expected to hear. "You won't believe who the insurer asks for by name." The atmosphere at Hawthorne Financial Services changed before anyone explained why. Managers who usually crossed the office with coffee in hand now moved quickly between closed conference rooms, carrying folders and speaking in low voices. Claire Bennett noticed the shift without looking up for long. After 9 years in the same department, she had learned that companies often revealed bad news through silence before anyone dared announce it. Around her, coworkers traded theories about layoffs, budget cuts, and another restructuring. But Claire kept reviewing claim files. Speculation had never protected a company from an insurance dispute. Perfect documentation had. Just before 10, the supervisor's phone rang. His confident tone disappeared within seconds. He opened a notebook, began writing rapidly, and then walked straight toward the executive wing. 15 minutes later, Daniel Brooks returned with an expression Claire had never seen on him before. He scanned the room and asked, "Where is Claire Bennett?" Every keyboard seemed to stop at once. Claire raised her hand slowly. Daniel looked almost embarrassed as he said, "The external insurer wants to speak with you. Specifically, you." The largest conference room was already full when Claire entered. Monica Hayes from HR sat beside the CFO and the Vice President of Operations. Across from them were 2 representatives from the insurance carrier. The older one, Richard Coleman, stood immediately and shook Claire's hand with a level of respect that made the executives glance at one another. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "I've been trying to identify the person behind these files." He opened a binder filled with years of claim records, compliance reports, and verification logs. Page after page carried Claire's notes, cross-references, and corrections. Richard explained that his team reviewed thousands of company files every year, but Hawthorne's documentation was unusually strong. Missing approvals had been caught before submission. Inconsistent reports had been corrected. Weak claims had been rebuilt into defensible records. "This isn't routine clerical work," he said. "This is risk prevention." Claire answered quietly that she had only tried to make sure every file could survive a future audit. Richard gave a small smile. "That is exactly the point. Your work has likely prevented denied claims, penalties, legal disputes, and major financial losses." He slid a summary across the table. The estimated savings reached far beyond anything the executives had expected. For years, Hawthorne had praised sales teams for bringing money into the company while barely noticing the woman who had been stopping it from leaking out. Claire watched Daniel's face change as the meaning settled in. He remembered the impossible deadlines, the extra files, and every time her reliability had been rewarded with nothing more than another task. By lunchtime, the story had spread through the building. Employees who had barely spoken to Claire now smiled at her in the hallway. Some congratulated her. Others looked at her with the startled curiosity people reserve for something valuable they had mistaken for ordinary. Claire accepted the attention politely, but she felt no triumph. What she felt was relief. Someone had finally seen the invisible extra work, the late evenings, and the care hidden behind every perfect claim package. Recognition had not arrived because she demanded it. It had arrived because an outside expert had forced management to look directly at what had been sitting in the corner for 9 years. Late that afternoon, Monica Hayes called Daniel into her office and closed the door. On her desk lay the insurer's report, Claire's salary history, and a folder marked Compensation Review. The numbers inside made one fact impossible to ignore. The company's most valuable employee had also been one of its most underpaid. What HR prepared for the next morning would stun the entire department. Success doesn't always arrive with applause. It often begins in silence. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more unforgettable workplace stories, and let us know below. Do you think loyalty should always be rewarded? Claire barely slept that night. Her mind kept replaying the insurer's words, not because she expected anything to change, but because they had confirmed something she had quietly believed for years. Her work mattered. Whether anyone inside the company acknowledged it or not, had never changed the quality of what she did. By the time she arrived the next morning, the office looked exactly the same. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, coffee machines hissed in the break room, and keyboards echoed across the department. Yet beneath that familiar routine, something felt different. Conversations stopped for a second when Claire walked past. Coworkers who had barely noticed her for years now greeted her with warm smiles, while others watched with open curiosity, wondering what management would do after the insurer's remarkable report. Less than an hour after everyone settled in, an email from Human Resources appeared in Claire's inbox. It contained only one sentence. Please meet with Monica Hayes at 10 a.m. No explanation, no agenda. Several coworkers noticed Claire standing up at the scheduled time and exchanged quiet glances. Some assumed HR wanted to congratulate her. Others whispered that the company might simply be collecting more information for the audit. Claire ignored the speculation and walked calmly toward the executive floor, carrying nothing except a small notebook she rarely used. Whatever this meeting was about, she intended to approach it the same way she approached every claim file, with patience instead of assumptions. Monica Hayes welcomed her into the office with an expression far warmer than usual. Daniel Brooks was already there, along with the chief financial officer. A neatly organized folder rested in the center of the conference table. Monica took a slow breath before speaking. Claire, we've spent the last 18 hours reviewing the insurer's findings, your employment history, your performance evaluations, and the measurable impact of your work. She slid the folder across the table. Inside was a newly printed employment agreement. Claire glanced at the first page, expecting a routine update, but her eyes stopped on the compensation section. The annual salary printed in bold was $42,000 higher than the one on her current contract. For several seconds, she simply stared at the page without saying a word. Daniel broke the silence first. "We made a mistake," he admitted. "Not yesterday, not last year, for years." His voice carried none of the polished confidence Claire was used to hearing during staff meetings. "We kept rewarding visibility while overlooking consistency. We praised people for solving problems in front of us, but we failed to recognize the person who prevented problems before they ever reached us." Monica nodded in agreement. "This adjustment isn't a bonus," she added. "It's a correction. Your salary should have reflected your value a long time ago." Claire looked up slowly, almost searching their faces for signs that this was some elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, she found only sincerity. When the meeting ended, Monica asked one final question. "Would you mind if we shared the news with the department?" Claire smiled gently. "If it helps people understand that quiet work still matters, then yes." Less than 30 minutes later, employees gathered in the main conference area for what they assumed would be another routine business update. Instead, the CEO thanked Claire publicly for her years of dedication and acknowledged that the company's strongest safeguard had never been expensive software or complicated procedures. It had been a woman who quietly refused to let standards slip. The room erupted into applause. Some people smiled proudly, others lowered their eyes, remembering every time they had walked past the quiet desk in the corner without realizing who was sitting there. For the first time in 9 years, Claire returned to her desk, not as the invisible employee everyone relied on without noticing, but as someone whose value could no longer be ignored. Yet the greatest change wasn't the raise, the applause, or the new contract. It was the respect that had finally found its way to the person who had earned it all along. The excitement surrounding Claire's promotion didn't disappear after a single day. It settled over the office like a quiet shift in the weather. People who had once hurried past her desk now stopped to ask questions about documentation, compliance, and claim preparation. For years they had assumed her work was simple because it looked effortless. Now they understood that it only looked easy because she had spent nearly a decade mastering every detail. Claire answered every question with the same patience she had always shown. She wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. She simply wanted the work to be done correctly, just as she always had. The biggest surprise came from management itself. Instead of treating the insurer's report as a one-time success, the executive team launched a complete review of the company's internal processes. They discovered that many of the department's best practices weren't written in official manuals at all. They existed only because Claire had quietly created personal checklists, verification systems, and documentation routines that prevented costly mistakes before they happened. Those methods had never been required by policy. She had developed them simply because she believed every file should be able to withstand the toughest audit imaginable. What management had once mistaken for ordinary paperwork turned out to be the invisible foundation supporting the company's entire claims operation. Within weeks, Claire was invited to help redesign the documentation process across multiple departments. For the first time in her career, executives asked for her opinion before making decisions, instead of after problems appeared. New employees trained under guidelines based on her workflow, while department managers encouraged teams to follow the standards she had quietly practiced for years. Something else changed as well. Impossible deadlines were no longer dropped onto her desk without discussion. Workloads became balanced, responsibilities were shared more fairly, and people finally understood that reliability should never be rewarded with endless extra work. One afternoon, Richard Coleman returned for a follow-up meeting with senior leadership. Before leaving, he stopped by Claire's desk and smiled. "I hoped this company would recognize what it had," he said. "Too many businesses wait until their best people leave before realizing their value." Claire thanked him for speaking honestly during the audit. Richard shook his head. "I didn't create your reputation," he replied. "I simply pointed out what had been sitting here all along." As the office slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Claire noticed something that mattered even more than her new salary. The newest employees no longer believed the quiet desks belonged to unimportant people. They had learned that the loudest voice in a room isn't always the most valuable one. Sometimes the person changing a company's future is simply the one who never stops doing the right thing, even when nobody is watching. Nearly 6 months had passed since Claire Bennett signed the contract that changed her career. The excitement surrounding the announcement had faded, conversations had moved on to other projects, and the framed photo of her standing beside the executive team had become just another picture hanging in the hallway. But unlike so many corporate promises, this one hadn't been forgotten. The company truly had changed. Performance reviews were rewritten from the ground up, promotions were no longer based on who spoke the loudest during meetings, and every department was required to document individual contributions instead of giving credit only to team leaders. New employees learned Claire's documentation system during orientation, and one sentence had quietly become part of the company's culture: never mistake quiet for ordinary. Everyone knew exactly why that sentence existed. Claire, however, remained exactly the same person. She still arrived before everyone else, still sat at the same desk by the window, and still greeted people with the same warm smile. She had even turned down a private office. When Monica Hayes asked why, Claire simply replied, "This corner carried me through the hardest years of my life. I don't need a bigger office to prove I've earned my place." That answer spread through the building faster than any company memo ever could. One rainy afternoon, Daniel Brooks walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. This time he wasn't bringing another impossible assignment or another last-minute deadline. He sat beside Claire without saying a word for several moments before quietly admitting, "I've replayed the last 9 years in my head more times than I can count. I kept telling myself I trusted you more than anyone else. That's why I always gave you the difficult work. But trust isn't an excuse for overlooking someone." Claire looked at him calmly. There was no anger left in her expression, only the kind of peace that comes after carrying a heavy weight for far too long. Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had haunted him ever since the insurer's visit. "Why didn't you leave? You had every reason to." Claire smiled faintly and stared through the rain-covered window. "I almost did," she admitted. "More than once." She told him how, 3 years after joining the company, her mother became seriously ill. Medical bills consumed nearly every dollar she earned. After her father passed away, she also helped support her younger brother through college. Starting over somewhere else felt too risky. Every year she promised herself she would stay just a little longer, hoping that hard work would eventually matter. "Some nights," she whispered, "I'd sit alone in this office, wondering if anyone would ever notice that I stayed late fixing mistakes no one even knew existed." Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time, he realized he had never truly known the woman who had quietly protected his entire department. "I'm sorry," he said. Claire gently shook her head. "What's important isn't that people make mistakes. It's what they choose to do after they finally see them." The company's internal investigation revealed far more than anyone expected. Executives reviewed years of reports, project files, insurance claims, and performance evaluations. The evidence painted an uncomfortable picture. Claire's work had repeatedly prevented expensive claim denials, regulatory problems, and compliance failures. Yet those successes had often been presented as departmental achievements without mentioning the person responsible. Several managers had unknowingly built impressive reputations on foundations Claire had quietly strengthened behind the scenes. No scandals erupted, and no dramatic confrontations filled the office. Instead, accountability arrived the same way Claire had always worked, with patience, evidence, and fairness. One senior manager lost his leadership position after executives concluded he had consistently taken credit for improvements created by his team. Another was denied a promotion because years of employee feedback showed a pattern of ignoring reliable performers while rewarding visibility instead of results. Human Resources publicly acknowledged that the company's evaluation system had failed employees whose greatest strengths were consistency, integrity, and quiet excellence. New safeguards were introduced to ensure every contribution could be traced to the people who actually performed the work. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. And unlike revenge, justice allowed the company to become stronger instead of more divided. Several weeks later, the CEO invited Claire to speak during orientation for newly hired employees. She almost declined, insisting she wasn't comfortable standing in front of large groups, but eventually agreed. Standing before dozens of nervous new faces, she held up an ordinary claims folder. "If I showed you this 9 years ago," she began, "most people would have seen nothing more than paperwork." She paused before continuing. "I see families whose insurance claims won't be denied because every document is complete. I see people who will never know a stranger stayed late to protect them. That's the strange thing about doing the right job. The people who benefit from it may never learn your name." The room became completely silent. Claire wasn't speaking about documents anymore. She was speaking about every quiet employee who had ever wondered whether their effort mattered. As she stepped away from the podium, the audience rose to its feet. The applause seemed endless, but one person caught Claire's attention more than anyone else. A young analyst named Emma stood in the front row with tears in her eyes. After the presentation, Emma approached her. "I was going to resign next week," she admitted. "I thought hard work didn't matter here anymore. Then I learned your story." Claire smiled gently, unsure what to say. Emma continued, "Watching what happened to you reminded me why I started this career in the first place. If you could keep believing for 9 years, I can keep believing a little longer." For a moment, Claire couldn't speak. She had spent years thinking success would mean a bigger paycheck, a better title, or finally hearing the words, "You deserved this all along." But standing there, listening to someone say she had inspired them not to give up, she realized the greatest reward had never been the extra $42,000. It wasn't the promotion, the applause, or the recognition. It was knowing that her perseverance had become someone else's hope. All those lonely evenings, all the silent sacrifices, every overlooked achievement, and every unfair evaluation had not been meaningless after all. Without realizing it, she had become the example she herself had desperately needed during her darkest years. That evening, Claire was the last person to leave the office. She paused beside the same corner desk where she had spent nearly a decade wondering if anyone noticed her work. She ran her hand across its worn wooden surface and smiled. So many memories lived there. Evenings spent correcting files that carried someone else's mistakes, weekends devoted to protecting clients she would never meet, performance reviews that described her as merely reliable, while overlooking everything she had truly accomplished. For years, she believed those sacrifices had disappeared into silence. She had been wrong. They had simply been waiting for the truth to catch up. As the office lights dimmed behind her, Claire realized something she wished every overlooked employee in the world could hear. Honest work is not always rewarded quickly. Fairness is not always immediate, and recognition does not always arrive when we think it should. But integrity never loses its value. The world may overlook it for a season, managers may fail to appreciate it, and louder voices may receive the applause first. Yet when the moment of truth finally arrives, character speaks louder than confidence. Consistency outlasts talent, and quiet dedication becomes impossible to ignore. Sometimes the most valuable person in an entire company is the one who never once asked anyone to notice, because they were too busy doing the right thing.